Everybody. We know it's December, and we're happy to have you with us today. We're going to be talking about commonly misunderstood standards for ELA grades K to 5. So my name is Marissa Hooper. I work with Demonstrated Success and on the data coaching contract with the state. I'm here with Karen Matzo, who will mainly be delivering this webinar today.
And say hello to Kristen Crawford, who is our New Hampshire assessment administrator. So she's here for posterity.
Yep. And first, and Gray Harrington is here today as well. She is also works for the department. So if you have any questions, please ask them in either Gray or us. We will be able to answer. So first and foremost, we just want to say thank you to the New Hampshire Department of Ed who allows us to make and deliver these webinars to you as part of that data coaching contract. Just so you know, everyone is going to be muted. It works best for these kinds of webinars. However, you still can ask questions. So there's a both Q&A and the chat section of the webinar for Zoom, and you can use either of those. We'll be able to answer your questions. The biggest question that we get is if we will get, or if you'll get a PD certificate, a video or a recording, slide deck, and any resources. And yes, about 24 hours after the webinar ends, you will receive an email that will have a link to the PD certificate. It will also have the slide deck and other documents, and then it will have a link to our YouTube page where a recording of this webinar will go up probably in about 2 to 3 days. It will be on YouTube. And at the end, you will receive a brief survey. So we always appreciate your feedback. We love to read it, use it, and make these as best as we can. So please take the few seconds it takes for that feedback. And then I will pass it off to Karen to get us started.
Hello, everybody. Welcome and thanks for taking the time today. We have a few learning targets for today. First, we're going to talk about the progression of the key Common Core standards across grade levels and how they evolve in meaning and complexity. And we are going to talk about some commonly misunderstood ELA standards and explore some strategies to uncover and address standards in general. Okay, so, all right. I think by now we all are firmly rooted in the idea that we are using the Common Core standards for English language arts, right? So we're happy about that. And, it's been a long time. Those standards started in 2010. And I remember delivering professional development at that time when they were first being introduced. So I'm really happy actually that we're still using them because switching around makes things complicated unnecessarily. And I'm a big advocate. So I did want to draw your attention to a section of the standards that rarely gets attention, especially for ELA. Math has these 8 math practices, and I just want to draw everyone's attention to the narrative before the standards in the Common Core standards, and it speaks to the portrait of students who meet ELA standards. And so this gives you sort of a gestalt guide to some of the thinking behind the standards and the big transferable goals of these standards. So students demonstrate independence. They build strong content knowledge. They're able to respond to the varying demands of audience, task, purpose, and discipline. And again, these are such transferable skills. They comprehend as well as critique. They value evidence. They use technology and digital media strategically and capably. And someday we're going to have to add AI to that. And they come to understand others' perspectives and cultures. And I like that last one because it really speaks to some of that cultural awareness. So I want to, oh, Marissa, you made a lovely change here. Melissa is our slide designer. I had different colors, and Marissa has made it very nice with the green. So what I want to emphasize here is that the beautiful thing about the ELA standards is they are a series of steps. They stay the same. The anchor standards are the anchor standards. And they build in complexity and challenge, but they stay the same K through 12. And this is a tool that I have just a few slides to sort of show you that. I think it's important to remember that an ELA standard at a grade level is an end of grade level goal, right? So you can feel free to toggle between related standards in the grade below and the grade above as needed. The goal is that by the end of third grade, for example, right, students can ask and answer questions and do what they need to do for third grade text. But you can really feel free to be fluid in there as the teaching demands. And I'm just going to show you some progressions of standards here. We have reading for informational text, and this is the first grade standard that we'll start rather with the anchor standard. I apologize. So the anchor standard is read closely to determine what the text says explicitly and make logical inferences from it, cite specific textual evidence when writing or speaking to support conclusions drawn from the text. And this is for key ideas and details, and it is the anchor standard for reading informational text. And so obviously this is going to look different in kindergarten. It starts in kindergarten with prompting and support ask and answer questions about key ideas in a text and details. And then in first grade, they take away the scaffold, right, of the prompting. And then in second grade, they add on, okay, so we need to address the details as related to who, what, where, when, why, and how. And then in third grade, students are asked to begin to start referring to the text explicitly as the basis for their answers. And then in fourth grade, we start into inference. So in third grade, you're going to ask and answer questions, and it could still be explicit in the text. And fourth grade, we're making that leap. I'm going to draw inferences from the text, and I'm going to use the text to support my answers. Then in fifth grade, we go to quotes, quoting accurately. And now in sixth grade, we're starting to cite that textual evidence. Now you need multiple pieces in seventh grade of textual evidence. And then you have to evaluate the evidence in eighth grade. And you have to choose the evidence that most closely supports or most strongly supports. So I think that that is a pretty fabulous example of this. I'm just going to go back one of how it's a staircase. The ELA standards are a staircase of building complexity and challenge. We're putting this particular slide in most of our webinars around standards just because, a lot of times when we get to middle schools and then to high schools, there is negative communication down the line about what wasn't done earlier, right? And so we want to discourage that and just say, we move forward assuming positive intentions, assuming all of the teachers before us did their level best to lead students towards standards mastery in the previous grades. Because again, we want to build those bridges and as opposed to building walls. So when the Common Core standards came out, there were three major shifts. And these shifts are really important, and they have made a significant change to how we teach in ELA. The first one is regular practice, and I'm going to go through each of them in more detail, so I'll just go over the three right now quickly. The first is regular practice with complex texts and academic language. So a lot of times, much more often with these standards, instructors are encouraged, or teachers are encouraged to use complex texts in their teaching. And even if it's short texts, much more frequently, teachers are encouraged to use short, complex texts, chunks of text that demand that close reading. The second one is reading, writing, and speaking grounded in evidence from texts, both literary and informational. Right. So we have that evidence piece and building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. And it's this last shift. We see that in all of the newest curriculum tools, literacy and ELA curriculum tools. So even I was just working with bookworms today. I'm trying to think of EL, expeditionary learning, that curriculum. They have very, very complex content rich nonfiction texts in there. And it's been a shift in curriculum materials. All right, let's go back for a sec and let's talk about complex texts and academic language. When we think about text complexity, there is a lot to think about. And down at the bottom, you can see Achieve the Core, Understanding Text Complexity. If you want to expand your knowledge more after this today, then that's a good link to go to. When we think about text complexity, we think about the relationship. We don't just think about sentences and vocabulary, we think about the relationship of the text to the student. So that first bullet speaks to reader variables, such as motivation, knowledge, and experience. That's going to inform text complexity. You know, if a student is unmotivated or disengaged from the text, that is going to raise the text complexity for them. And we need to keep that in mind. If the student lacks prior knowledge around the text, the content of the text, again, that's going to raise text complexity. The second bullet speaks to task variables such as purpose. What are we using the text for? And when we think about that, are we using the text to do a close read, to infer information, to find evidence? Because those are high demand tasks. Or are we using the text to read and get the overall meaning? Right? That's a different activity. So it depends what we're asking students to do with the text. And complexity is, generated by the task assigned and the questions posed. So again, what are we asking them to do? And then the second piece with the questions, we're going to speak to that. What are the text dependent or non-text dependent questions that we're asking students to grapple with around the text? Now, those are sort of some qualitative aspects. Some more qualitative aspects are the levels of meaning, structure, and language conventionality. And what that really means is, can the text be interpreted in a lot of different ways? Are there symbolic meanings within the text that have to be inferred? Or does the text not have that? Or does the text have that and maybe that's not going to be part of the task that you're going to ask students to work with? The second is structure. Is the text predictable? Does it follow a familiar structure that the students have been exposed to before? Is it a linear structure? Does it go back and forth? Does it toggle between perspectives? There's a lot of different ways to think about the complexity of the structure of the text. And then we have the conventionality of language. How complex are the sentences? How complex? How is it structured? How does the narrative and how is the language used? Are there a lot of multiple meaning words? These are all questions that when we as teachers are choosing texts and thinking about text complexity, these are all things that we need to evaluate. Now, there's the quantitative evaluation of text, and those are just some different readability measures. And I can't remember whether I kept that in or not, but those are like lexiles. So you can lexile any text. You can basically copy a chunk of any text and put it into lexiles.com, and it'll give you back a lexile number, a range, which will then be, you can parallel to to a grade level, and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of different readability measures. There's a Kincaid, they had them in Fontes and Pinnell. So, but in general, Lexiles and Lexile.com is the most universal readability measure. So if you're a science teacher or a social studies teacher, or you have a piece of text that you're thinking of using and you want to explore the text complexity, you can go to lexiles.com and they'll help you with that. This is also around shift one, the complex text, and what this image speaks to the cognitive load. So, if you have a complex text, you want to keep the cognitive load low. For example, if you're working with a complex text, you may scaffold or support students by having them work in small groups, giving them a protocol for their close read. You may want to front load some of the vocabulary, pre-teach it. There's all sorts of ways to lighten the cognitive load when you're working with complex texts. Now, if you're working with a non-complex text, a more straightforward, accessible text, then you can afford to dive right in and ask those complex questions. You can lower the scaffolds. So that's something else to think about. Yep, here we have the text complexity bands and those quantitative measures. So you can see here, you see the Lexile column in the middle, the Fleisch Kincaid, ATO. Some of these I'm familiar with, some of them I'm not. I would stick with Lexiles. I think that Lexiles are our most common and universal language. And this is, again, highlighting some of the things you need to think about when you're thinking about text complexity, organization, the graphics, if there are complex graphs or images that need to be interpreted, and the different text features, how complex they are, the predictability and the vocabulary that's included in the sentence structure, like I said earlier. And then under purpose, how explicit is the goal of the text? How many layers of purpose does the text have? And what are we going to ask students to access in terms of those layers? And then their discipline and background knowledge. That's also that also informs text complexity and the references and allusions to other texts, right? That can send kids off into if you're working with the text that then alludes to or refers to a text that the students haven't heard of, that can add to the text complexity. This is just an example. This is an example of two slices of language that basically are conveying the same thing. And I've met a lot of teachers who will then ask me, well, why do we need to make it complicated? Why do we need to, make kids struggle through the complex texts where, let every nation know whether it wishes us well or ill. Now, let's just take that. That is not language structure or vocabulary or sentence structure. That it's not, the vocabulary is pretty straightforward, but the structure and the way the language is being used, that's unfamiliar to students. Okay. Whereas at the bottom, we want every country in the world, whether it's our friend or enemy, blah, blah, blah. That is a much more predictable and familiar language and organization. We have to help students with scaffolds and tools to help them navigate through this complex text. Because in their lives, in their reading and writing and learning lives, they are going to have to navigate in every sort of instructional manual or every sort of legislative piece in the news. If our kids want to be informed and capable, we have to help them navigate complex texts. And it starts in kindergarten up through 12th grade, right? So here's our second shift, reading, writing, and speaking grounded in evidence from the texts, both literary and informational. And so we have increased attention to writing that requires the use of evidence. So, careful analysis, well defended claims, and clear information. And we also have narrative writing to convey personal experience still. But I really want to say this clearly. As you move up in the grades, narrative writing is de emphasized, and argument and informational writing starts to become more dominant. And I understand, kindergarten, first grade, second grade students are learning to write, and narrative by far is the most accessible genre for young students. When we start getting to third, fourth, fifth, sixth grade, we have to start adjusting for this balance. And the beautiful thing is, this balance of increased argument and informational writing, it's not just in ELA. We have all of the other subjects to support this growth in argument and informational writing. So we do this in math, we do it in social studies, we do it in science. So we have these two ingredients that sort of inform the shift to the reading, writing, and speaking grounded in evidence from text. We have writing from sources. So we're reading and then we are taking information from sources and using those sources in our writing. And we have text dependent questions and answers. It is our responsibility to formulate effective text dependent questions so that students have to go into the text and they have to push themselves to answer the questions. And this just speaks to the importance of close analytical reading and how a little bit of what I was saying earlier, we need to teach our kids to engage with the text of sufficient complexity and examine the text and its meaning thoroughly and methodically, and encouraging students to read and reread deliberately. And I remember when the Common Core standards came out in 2010, there was a lot of talk about how incredibly unengaging close reading can be. It is rigorous. It requires a persistence that our students are often unaccustomed to exerting. And so my advice is to start with small chunks of texts. And you have to be really careful. Small chunks of texts in limited time periods. And providing those scaffolds, providing peer support, providing front loading of text structure, vocabulary, and so on. Sticky notes, those are great. As I was saying earlier about having our obligation as teachers be creating effective text-dependent questions for our students, we absolutely have to read the text ourselves closely before creating text-dependent questions. And while we are reading that text, it is our responsibility to identify what are the core content and ideas that we want our students to extract from this text. What is the vocabulary that they're going to need both to understand the text and communicate around the text and the language structures as well? And then we're also going to have to go through and identify those difficult sections. We need to anticipate the barriers that our students are going to have. And what we then do is we design our text-dependent questions to help guide students through that complex text. So we start with easier questions, and that's always the case, right? Whenever you're even deciding an assessment, always start with the easier questions so that your students have a comfortable entry point. And then you're going to slowly escalate the rigor or increase the rigor of the questions to take them where you want them to go. You're obviously going to connect the lesson standards to the questions, and you're going to create your culminating assessment aligned to the standards, the content, the ideas that you want them to extract from their text. All right, we're on to shift 3. And this is building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. And again, this is where I was saying that there's been such a switch in curriculum materials because ELA curriculum materials seem to have so much more content. And that's also come up in the science of reading, is that is one of our goals, to use content-rich nonfiction to build background knowledge and vocabulary for our students. And ingredients here are building knowledge in the disciplines through text. And what that means is in science, social studies, math, our technical subjects, use text to build knowledge. Give students text so that instead of standing and delivering information as a social studies or science teacher, help your students, give your students a controlled amount of previewed text and help them through your own text-dependent questions that you create, and then teach them how to create their own text-dependent questions to become learners on their own, using text to be able to learn from text, because this is a tremendous transferable skill. As students get older and as they enter the real world, we want to develop self-motivated and capable learners. And then balancing fiction and nonfiction. And we spoke a little bit to that, is that we're increasing the nonfiction a little bit, but definitely having a balance of those two. These two pieces are reciprocal, right? We want to deepen content knowledge. I'm starting on the right, using language and literacy skills. And that's what I was just describing. We're going to use our reading skills to increase our content knowledge. And then at the same time, we're going to deepen language and literacy skills in our reading, writing about and discussing content so that it works together. They're reciprocal. Text sets are a great way in the content areas and also in ELA to achieve this. So if you are studying the Revolutionary War, okay, you could go and create a text set. Is it Johnny Tremaine? Yep, it's Johnny Tremaine that we all read. You might include sections from Johnny Tremaine. Then you might also include in that unit primary source documents that your students are going to have to work through, and that requires some serious close reading. You might use some digital text, and then you might use some textbook text or literary nonfiction. All right. So, and then you come together and you bring all of these types and genres of text around the same content area. And that helps to address shift 3 of building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. Okay, those were the 3 shifts. We're going to shortly move into some misunderstood standards, but before we do that, I'm just going to go through the anchor standards. Remember how at the beginning I talked about the stairway of complexity in the ELA standards and how from K to 12, it's the same anchor standards, but it just builds. So we have 3 standards under key ideas and details, and in general, they address close reading, citing text evidence, and inferences. And then we have 2. The second standard addresses mostly themes and the development and summarizing of themes. 3, development interaction, compare and contrasting across texts. Craft and structure, the next 3 standards, they are more about the creation of texts and choices that authors make. So what language and vocabulary has an author chosen to use? What text structure, part to whole or part to part, has an author chosen to work within or to develop? And what's the author's point of view or the author's purpose? Integration of knowledge of ideas. That's it's where you address some of your research standards and integrating different content, language, media. That's where we address claims, evidence, and reasoning, and we evaluate the relevance of different reasoning and evidence. And that's where we're asked to take multiple looks from different perspectives. We analyze, we compare, we contrast 2 or more texts. And then that last standard, read and comprehend a wide range of texts, that's in every grade level, and that's at grade level. And I chose this time to just have all of us remember how complicated reading is, right? So I hope that many of you have seen this, the strands of the reading rope, and you've seen this image before. And I just want to emphasize that it takes a heck of a lot of cognitive power to read effectively. We have two different sections of the reading rope. On the top, we have language comprehension. And what we bring to language comprehension is so many different skills and knowledge bases. So we bring to the reading our background knowledge. What information are we coming in with for our background knowledge related to this text? And our vocabulary. What is the vocabulary that every student brings to the reading task? Language structures. What language structures are we familiar with? What organizational structures are we familiar with? Compare and contrast. Are we familiar with whole to part, part to whole? Like how compare and contrast? We have beginning, middle, and end. We have all sorts of language structures that students have to contend with. Verbal reasoning, are we aware of metaphors and similes and how to draw inferences? And then just basic literary concepts, print concepts, different genres. How do we categorize the text that we're reading? Can we, if it's nonfiction, right? Well, so if it's fiction, we're going to know to look for that beginning, that middle, and that end. We're going to know to look for that climax, that resolution. All right. If it's nonfiction, it could be a lot of different structures. So sometimes it helps to point out the structure of the text. So students have to contend with all of that. And then if you look at the bottom of the rope, we have the phonemic awareness, the phonological awareness, rather, our understanding of syllables. It's all the things for decoding. And then we take that into phonics. Can we take our phonemic awareness and then can we apply it to the actual image of the letters and make sense of that and the automaticity of that? And that's incredibly challenging. And then we also have sight word recognition. So, which is independent, and that's a lot around visual memory and being able to hold, okay, that configuration of letters is read as this word and means this. So you have to take all of those things and slowly you start in kindergarten, and there's a lot of spaces between the ropes because, integrating these skills is difficult and it's not automatic. And the hope is that as you move through your reading instruction, it becomes more automatic, and all of these different demands get tighter and more automatic. And each of us, we know that we're trying to build skilled readers. So, and hopefully our students are turning into skilled readers. Okay. Reading is also impacted by text, task, and the socio-cultural context. So we have reading to the right. And again, reading is informed or impacted by what a student brings to the table in terms of word recognition. And then at the bottom, language comprehension. If we go out to the left to the green circle, it brings in that piece of motivation, engagement, a student's executive functioning, their ability to use the different wealth of strategies that teachers have taught them. Okay. And then in the middle, we have some of those bridging processes. And this gets, their knowledge of vocabulary, reading fluency, cognitive flexibility. So again, there's an incredible amount that goes into skilled reading. Okay, now that was all about reading standards. And here are our anchor standards for writing. We have text types and purposes. And then generally, a lot of K through 5 classes, they sort of move through the year and they explore different genres. So argument in K through 5 is actually labeled opinion. And then we have information and explanatory writing and narrative writing. And then in production and distribution, we have the standards speak to the writing process. That's number 5. And number 4, around creating organized writing that is specified for task and purpose and audience. And then 6 is the use of technology and publishing and collaboration. And 7, 8, and 9 focus on research and presentation. So we should be able to write and short and sustain in response to short and sustained inquiry. We should be able to write, paraphrase information. We should be able to write to credible sources. We need to be able to write and use evidence for support. And then again, it's similar, paralleled to the reading. Number 10, we're going to write often and in varied genres at grade level. Now, the speaking and listening standards, when I have done work in various school districts, it's interesting. When we look at gaps for assessment, it's often the speaking and listening standards that are the ones that are not assessed. And I wanted to say that because I feel that they are actually quite important, because if you think about transferable skills, the ability to listen effectively and gain information and communicate and collaborate with peers, with coworkers, it is really a these are very foundational skills needed in navigating the workforce, right? And college and career. So I just wanted to emphasize that. And our anchor standards in speaking and listening, the first 3 speak to comprehension and collaboration. So we help students to participate in conversations and collaborations. And again, these standards start simply in K, and they just build in complexity to grade 12. We support our students in helping them and to interact with information in different formats. So it's listening, reading online, reading printed text, listening and interacting with information in groups. And the third is we work with their ability to take point of view or identify point of view and engage in rhetoric. The second probably can be aligned with more of the speaking standards, and we help our students present clearly, tailoring their presentation to task, purpose, and audience, help them use visuals and media to enhance their communication presentations, and adapting their capacity for speech to the task, purpose, and audience. And that's where we talk about formal and informal language. We have code switching. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but it's the ability to adapt the way you're interacting to the setting and the culture and the need. And we have language standards. It's our grammar when speaking and listening, our punctuation and spelling and writing, using language effectively in different contexts when speaking and writing. And vocabulary has had a revival in our science of reading conversations, right? So determining word meanings of unknown words, strategies for that, understanding figurative language, nuance in language, being able to choose your words for effect, and using academic and domain specific language in reading, writing, speaking, and listening. Any questions? If you have questions, write them in and Marissa will grab them from the chat.
There are no questions at this time.
Okay. So I'm going to speak to missed opportunities. A lot of the times, ELA standards, we forget to use them in service to one another. So we're going to speak to that first. The standards relate to each other. And when we are designing instruction, we want to pull the standards in service of each other. because these standards overlap. And so the next few slides are I'm going to show you that in varying grade levels. If I'm designing instruction, I can see the following language standards and foundational skill standards as incredibly closely related, and it's appropriate to address them in the same unit of instruction, and they depend on one another. So if we're going to talk about spelling, untaught words phonetically, okay, and phonemic awareness, we can go down to foundational skills where students are asked to demonstrate understanding of syllables, sounds, or phonemes, right? They're asked to segment phonemes, and they're asked to apply grade level word analysis skills and decoding, right? So we've been able to address those standards all in the same instructional unit. And this is a third grade example. Speaking and listening under presentation of knowledge and ideas, right? We want to report on a topic or text with appropriate facts, relevant descriptive details, speaking clearly at an understandable pace. We go down to the language standards 3.3 A through B, and it says right here, we need to use our knowledge of language in reading, writing, speaking, and listening. We need to be able to choose our phrases for effect. So if we go back up, and it says relevant descriptive details. So we want to be able to choose our details for effect, okay, or our description for effect in our writing. And then recognizing and observing differences between the conventions of spoken and written standard English. And again, that speaks to our ability to speak clearly and to include what is appropriate and identify what is appropriate for that presentation. Here we have a grade 4 for the standard that speaks to the structure of text. And it says here chronology, comparison, cause, effect. And then we have a parallel writing standard that speaks to clear and coherent writing. And the organization of that writing is appropriate to task, purpose, and audience. So if I'm telling a story, I might do it chronologically, and that's appropriate for my audience. So again, those two standards are dependent on each other. And this last slide here just shows you how all of these standards, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, reading for literacy, informational, writing, speaking, listening, and language, all speak to structure, okay, and sentences. So this is overall structure in a drama, okay, or a particular story. Compare and contrast structure again for informational text. Then there's the writing standard that speaks to an organizational structure appropriate to task and purpose and audience. Then we have the speaking and listening where it speaks to, okay, tell a story or recount a topic in an appropriately organized manner. And then the language standard speaks to combine and reduce sentences for meaning reader. So this is on a smaller structure. It's your structure of sentences. But again, all of these standards would be included in a unit of instruction. And in terms of standards and having them in service to one another, the listening is input. These are our receptive skills, listening. And then the expressive is the output, speaking, right? And the same with reading. Reading is the input or the receptive, although in some ways it's perceived as more active, right, than listening. And then the writing is the parallel, except it's the expressive. So if we don't, we have to help our students with the input or the receptive skills before we can ask them to use their expressive skills. They read and learn so that they have something to write about, okay? They listen and learn, or read actually, so they have something to speak about. And this is just a little bit a reminder, because I think most educators do this. Maybe sometimes we forget, but before we ask our students to write or speak, think time and rehearsal with peers and teachers is really important. Helping them with language frames, sentence starters, paragraph frames, sentence stems are all those supportive bridges or scaffolds between reading, writing, speaking, and listening and language. Reading and writing and language may be practiced with speaking and listening before reading and writing independently, sometimes too. So the standards use the standards in service of one another. And these are just some ideas. You could set up listening stations around the classroom where students are asked to listen to digital recordings of their teacher or someone else, and then in pairs or triads, and then informational text, and then they're asked to discuss the questions with their peers, the questions that are posed or left on the desk. Reciprocal teaching, and that's a whole other webinar, but it's a situation where 4 or 5 students come together and they have roles and they support one another. They read chunks of text aloud, and each of them takes a role, predicting, questioning, clarifying, and summarizing. And it's a supportive but still independent reading experience. And the last one is photo narratives, right? You can have students collect images and then orally record or narrate their story to accompany the images as a rehearsal for a storytelling activity. Okay, that was using standards in service of one another. The next, I just want to address foundational skills and fluency. We are using oral reading fluency as an assessment of reading ability. And you know what? That's great, because research has shown that oral reading fluency is a pretty good predictor and a pretty good substitute. And it's quick, it's easy to do, and we can get information about a student's reading ability. However, we need to remember that it's not fluency. When we time a student and the number that we get of words per minute, it's good information, but it's not fluency. Because along with that, fluency involves prosody or prosody, which is the cadence of how we read, how we handle punctuation, where we pause, when our voices go up and down. And it's important that we don't let that drop off when we're looking at oral reading fluency. So these are some of this is the standard reading with sufficient accuracy and fluency to support comprehension. We want students to read grade level text with purpose and understanding, reading grade level prose and poetry, and use context to confirm or self-correct. Now, there are some ideas around fluency routines, right? Choral, echo reading, multiple reads, and these are all strategies to support students in their reading fluency. Fluency work should be done above a reader's instructional level. You can start with easier texts, but you want to work with the students slightly above their instructional level when you're working on fluency. That's how students grow. We are very attached to the alphabetic principle now in our Science of Reading days, and it's incredibly important. But what I also want to say is that if a student can use other visual information along with the alphabetic principle to confirm word recognition or a picture, it's fine. Okay, we should help them use all of the cues that they can. This is another reminder. We're spending a lot of time K-3 on foundational skills, and as we should. We still need to help students apply those foundational skills in the context of independent reading. So these are some ideas, some reminders of how to do that. You can have students work with phonemic texts, phonemically regular texts that have the skills that you've taught them in them, and highlight and indicate, where they see learned patterns in paper copies. You can have them generate silly stories with each other with words that contain the patterns that they're learning. Or if they're listening, if you're doing a read aloud, you can have them do thumbs up every time they hear a phonemic pattern that they're learning or familiar with. right? So we have to be careful not to take away their independent reading altogether. Okay, some writing misconceptions. The first one is in kindergarten, this is the standard. Use a combination of drawing, dictating, and writing to compose informative and explanatory texts. Drawing is pre-writing. Drawing is writing, okay? It's beginning writing. And the way to start that is to help them by labeling their drawings with sounds or words as much as the student can do. And that counts. That is their writing. And I've seen some incredible kindergarten writing. Um, I want to emphasize here that keyboarding isn't noted in the standards until grade 3. Kindergarten, they are exploring keyboarding. Grades 1 and 2, they're using it, okay, or they're using technology. But keyboarding isn't necessarily a thing until 3rd grade. They can use video, audio, voice to text in K through 2 to publish, but they're not standards wise expected to actually type. Um, Another misconception or another reminder. And this is actually based in Universal Design for Learning. And Universal Design for Learning is where I understood this most clearly. When we're assessing student writing, it really is essential to be clear what the primary target is. If the target is assessing writing mastery, then you really have to employ access strategies and choice. You have to give a student choice and supports so that the student can reliably demonstrate their writing ability. If they're given a situation where they don't understand the content, or even if they have a fine motor delay, right, that's going to prevent them from fully articulating or conveying their writing thinking, you need to provide them with the supports. Or if they can't sit still or attend long enough, or there's a lot of different, you have to provide the supports that allow them to access the activity and show their best capacity. The same thing is with content. If your primary target is, explaining how butterflies turn or caterpillars turn into butterflies, if you really want to know that science knowledge, you may want to give a student a choice and not make them write about it, because writing is something they don't do very well, but they understand the science content very well. It's very important that you give them options for how to demonstrate their mastery. Okay, moving along. Any questions, Maris?
No questions, but I do just want to give you a heads up that it's like 4:10.
Thank you.
Oh, I just got a question. You mentioned at one point there was a de-emphasis at narrative reading and writing, but narrative writing is an option that students will get on their middle school essay for the New Hampshire SAS. Just a little confused because it seems like that's two different messages and narrative reading and writing being conveyed.
So in middle school, students are definitely still doing narrative reading and writing. You know, all I'm saying is that in science, social studies, in your technical subjects, that those are places where the informational text. I'm going to go into the middle school standards in the 6 through 8 webinar tomorrow. Um, Narrative reading and writing is still done in ELA in middle school, of course. And so it's just that we're building those informational and argument skills. Okay. So we don't want to talk about fiction and nonfiction as fake versus real. That's basically the takeaway here, because it's erroneous. There's a lot of different genres um, that fall within fiction and nonfiction. I want to just separate fiction and I mean form and genre. The structure speaks to the form of a text. Okay. A novel, a poem, an essay, a play, an article. those are all different forms of text, whereas a genre might be fiction, historical fiction, fantasy, mystery. Okay? So those are, I just wanted to clarify those two vocabulary words. Any other questions?
No.
So I just want to speak a little bit about breaking down standards. We really are obligated to address our standards and to break down our standards. And Marissa has provided us with a beautiful visual here. I think designed by Marissa, of identifying the key components of standards and unpacking standards here. And we're going to talk about that now. We also, just going to look, we're talking a little bit here about backward design. So you want to align the first thing, and I think probably most people on the webinar know this. Backward design is you start with the end in mind. You start by identifying the standards that you're going to address in a unit of instruction. You take the standards, you create your assessment tool, and then you backward plan your instruction to bring students to the place where they're ready to master the assessment and the standards that are aligned to that assessment. And obviously, you're going to check for gaps. Okay. You're going to find curriculum resources and you're going to collaborate with colleagues as you build that learning plan. Textbooks, standards, educational, all of the things. And Achieve the Core is something that we go to very often in our planning for developing these scopes and sequence. And your colleagues are great resources. So you're always going to set clear learning objectives for your lessons, and you're always going to translate them into student-friendly language and convey those standards, those goals to your students. And you're going to make the learning visible for them. And whenever possible, help students identify the standards that they're pursuing and monitor their own progress towards the goals. You're going to plan for differentiation and universal access when you're designing your instructional path. And here we have unpacking a standard. This is a bigger image of what I was referring to before. You have your standard, you identified the verbs and the nouns. The verbs are going to tell you about the skills that are demanded in that standard. And the language for that is students will be able to do blah, 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 okay? And the nouns and adjectives, those are going to direct you towards the knowledge and the understanding that students are going to acquire. They will know how to, and they will understand. It's hard to break down standards. A lot of times they have multiple components. And some standards are aimed at different developmental stages. You have to be able to be clear of what you're looking at. And like we said at the beginning, ELA standards, those are end of grade level mastery standards. So keep that in mind. These are some directions, right? You're going to isolate the keywords. It's sort of what we were just saying. Critical content, skill, and process for mastery. Look at the links between the standard and the overarching cluster, standards in the cluster. Look at the links between the standards within a cluster, okay? And turn what you're seeing into I can statements. So I've broken down a couple here. Describe the relationship. So the verbs are in orange, the nouns are in green. I'm going to let you look at that for a sec. And I broke this down into 4 statements, I can statements. I understand the events, ideas, or steps we have studied. I can describe 2 or more of them. I can describe how the ideas relate to each other. And I can use sequential vocabulary, which it speaks to up there, such as first, next, then, or cause and effect vocabulary, such as a result. in my explanation. I think actually, this is what we addressed at the beginning. This is just showing you how the standards build across the grades. And this is that same reading for informational text that I tracked from kindergarten through grade 8 earlier. This is just sort of ideas around how a teacher teaches at that level. So a teacher might model asking and answering questions through a think alouds and picture books and a 5W chart paper organizer for first grade. And in fourth grade, a teacher might model locating evidence for key ideas and inference, and they might do that through a think aloud. And they will likely show students how to use text annotation and project that. And you might do it together as a full class and help students name and annotating evidence and do it together. And then you have that gradual release where they might go back and do it in small groups and then do it and using language frames. Okay. Maurice, I'm going to
This
log
is
off.
okay.
All right. Actually, I can't log off. So we have to finish because I'm
No,
presenting.
yeah, that's okay. We can get through it in the next minute. This is just a webinar that was linked for our unpacking standards. So if you want to learn more, you can watch this webinar as well and go through sort of what Karen had just described.
Okay. And these are the performance level descriptors that the state has developed. And so you can see it gives you information about mastery of the end of year standards and how to think about that with a body of work. And this speaks to, making sure that your assessments are aligned to standards. Use backwards. This is what we were saying earlier. Okay. Don't forget to use formative assessment. It's the most powerful tool for uncovering students' misconceptions. Here are the important questions for students. Where am I going? What's my learning target? Where's my I can statement? Where am I in relation to that goal? And what's my next small step toward mastering that? And we need to include students in the conversation. When we're designing formative assessment, these are some tips. You definitely want to aim for responses that reveal how students think, not just what they remember. Encourage them to explain in math. Why? How did you get that answer? Design your prompts so that they will uncover or surface confusion or flawed thinking. We talked earlier about targeting in text the most important concepts when we ask text-dependent questions. Ask students to reflect on their learning and design some short and focused prompts. And aim for quality responses, not breadth of responses or long responses. And Marissa, this is beautiful. Do you want to read the ending quote?
Sure. We have that understanding the standards means more than knowing what to teach. It's knowing where we're headed and how to help students think deeply along the way. So emphasizing, it's not just knowing our own standards, but it's knowing where students are coming from and then where they're going. So making sure that we know vertically, right, our standards as well. And that's how we're going to be able to have students think more deeply if we have a wide knowledge of the standards from K-5, or if you're fifth grade, 6, 7, and 8. So thank you so much, everyone. I didn't see any more questions. Just, we do have some resources linked here. And so we also have, you're going to get the slide deck on the last slide is our email addresses as well. So if you have any questions for Karen or myself or Gray, or Kristen. Our email addresses are there. These are some upcoming webinars as well. We have no, you're good, an ELA in math, K to 2, better understanding assessments and standards. We know that we focus a lot on New Hampshire SAS, that's 3 to 8. So how can we help K to 2 better understand their assessments and standards? Um, so that is it. If you could take the time to fill out that survey, that would be amazing. And we thank you all for coming along this journey with us today.